The Glory of Christmas, written and performed by Adriel Brandt. Part 1. The Tree. Oliver de Bonancieux had a magnificently ancient, terribly noble name leading all the way back to the court of William the Conqueror. His family tree was full of lords and dukes and knights. His great-great-great-grandfather played squash with King George I, while Robert Walpole ran the British Parliament. Unfortunately for Oliver de Bonancieux, a name does not live and breathe and contribute to the family wealth. At least, it has not since his great-grandfather died under the tremendous weight of innumerable debts. The family de Bonancieux was cold, dead, and useless to Oliver, most recent of the name and its only bearer since his father's death. In fact, Oliver de Bonancieux was 3/4 an orphan, for his father was dead, and his mother was half dead.
"My heart is ruined,"
she would say.
"but as long as you need it, my dear Oliver, my body will keep on."
You must not blame Oliver's mother for these words. They were no complaint, but an apology. You see, Oliver's mother loved Oliver profoundly and deeply. So profoundly and so deeply that it broke her soul into intricate and jagged pieces that she could not give her son a happy, carefree, and comfortable childhood. For she was poor. Beyond poor, she was so poor that time and space became meaningless. The poorer you are, the smaller the world becomes, until your world is no longer a world but a hallway, filled and echoing with the irregular tickings of clocks hung too high upon the walls to see as you pass, or wind when their gears become loose. Oliver's mother's hallway had at its one end wet clay that cracked her hands and wearied her bones, forming bricks for buildings she will never have the strength to lift her eyes to see. At the other end of her hallway was Oliver, and the small orange light of the fire he had infallibly lit in the tiny grate of the single misshapen room that was their home. Oliver de Bonancieux used one solitary coal and careful pieces of last week's often soggy newspaper to light this fire every night. It only ever lasted until his mother sank upon her threadbare blanket in the corner after kissing Oliver on the forehead with her tired, dry lips. Oliver would watch her eyes glaze and close, one upon the other as she lay on her side, and feel still the cracks of her lips tingle on his forehead, while the 2 or 3 fitful tongues of flame died behind him, leaving the room in a soft darkness. For the darkness was soft when Oliver's mother was sleeping. It was soft and warm, though her sleeping breath fogged in the air like thin, cheap tobacco. Outside and through the streets until the mud resolved into cobblestones, and the cobblestones became polished enough to reflect the glow of golden lamps, a fog of breath as thick as the richest pipe smoke hovered above the courtyard of the governor's house. For not even the breath of the poor can compare to that of the rich. A rich man does not care what he wastes, and expels great gusts of perfectly good air with every exhalation, while a poor man refuses to waste even something as insubstantial as breath. Incidentally, this is why the rich man's voice is heard in every corner of the globe, while the poor man may as well be dumb. The progenitors of this magnificent cloud of wealthy, wasteful breath were waiting without a care for the cold, the night, or the poor for whom the cold was not an invigorating rarity, but an inexorably fatal relative. Above them, just before the steps of the great house, its uppermost needle a hand's breadth above the sills of the second-story windows, was an immense evergreen tree. A great dark shape it was, its myriad of ornaments glinting dully in the lights of the city beyond the courtyard, its own lights as yet invisible in its boughs. Electric lights, their mysterious cording disappearing up the steps and into the house. This was what the crowd was gathered to see, and it was a wonder their anticipatory energy was not enough to render their waiting at an end, and wreathe the tree in light at last. Finally, the governor himself appeared in the doors of his house, enveloped in a coat of truly immense size, the fur of which could have come from a whole forest of stoats. The governor had a veritable engine in his lungs, and it was full steam ahead as he welcomed his guests and introduced the tree they had all been regarding for an hour already. His face became lost in the fog of his breath as he waxed on and on. It rose up and disturbed the cloud formed by the guests. A lonely enough cloud it was, for the sky was as clear as only winter could allow. Using every tiny fragment of his own breath, the house page raced through the doors at an imperious gesture from his master. In a moment, the tree was baptized in holy effulgence, wrapped in gleaming brilliance, absolutely remade in a tremendous burst of golden electric light. The gathered crowd took an involuntary step backwards and drew in the entire fog above their heads in a collective and profound gasp. Their faces could not have been better illuminated in an equatorial summer. The tree was magnificent, astounding, beyond comparison. And yet, something was missing. The twinkle in his eye glowing inhumanly brilliant in the electric light, the governor gestured grandly to the very top of the tree. "Behold," he cried, and the North Star herself descended from the heavens and glittered upon the evergreen. An electric bulb, magnified and deified by a star-shaped home of quartz and crystal and diamond, the facets of which were without flaw and innumerable. The crowd fell to its knees before it, and the governor nodded, as if all were right in the world. The night page, skirting his way along the courtyard walls to the servants' entrance at the side of the house, was also transfixed. "It's only electric lights," said the day page on his way out. "I plugged 'em into the machine myself." But the night page shook his head. "It's the glory of Christmas," he whispered. The day page did not hear him. He was shrugging up his shoulders to protect his ears against the cold. "Make sure it doesn't spark," he advised, and disappeared into the darkness of the street. Oliver de Bonancieux, for he was the night page, did not watch him go. He had eyes only for the tree. His heart, which had never felt more full or large enough for 2 bodies, for 3 even, was thumping against his rib cage. "If only you could see this, Mother," he whispered. The crowd began to disperse, and Oliver reluctantly pulled his eyes away from the divine spectacle. He was expected indoors. This is The Glory of Christmas on Civil Radio, written and performed by Adriel Brandt. Part 2. The Star. Every night when Oliver de Bonancieux's mother fell asleep, Oliver would make sure his tiny fire was extinguished, and then creep as silently as a mouse out the crooked door. He would tiptoe down the uneven hallway of the wretched dwelling, slip out the entrance, and then race down the streets until he arrived at the walls of the governor's estate. Hidden in a cubby behind a brick in the shadows between street lamps, Oliver would pull out his page-boy uniform and dress right there in the street. Every morning before dawn, he would replace his accoutrements in their cubby and sprint back home, to be found asleep by his mother when she woke. She would kiss him softly on the forehead, trying not to wake him, and then leave as silently as a mouse for her long day of work, the light of the room's solitary high window wan and colorless despite the sunrise. The morning following the illumination of the governor's tree, Oliver de Bonancieux, pretending to be asleep, waited and waited for his mother's kiss, but it did not come. Eventually he cracked open an eye and saw his mother staring at the wall with a curious expression on her face. Oliver stretched out into a yawn and sat up.
"What's that upon the wall?"
his mother asked. She pointed at a small globe hung halfway up the wall, about as high as a boy could reach. It was whiter than the purest snow and shimmered even in the gloom of the misshapen room, and its little hook of gold was so smooth it could have been liquid. "Why, Mother, it's a Christmas ornament," he said. "Doesn't it brighten the place up?"
"It is lovely,"
said his mother, and she leaned forward to kiss him. "Makes my heart feel big and full," said Oliver. "Do you feel it?" His mother's dry lips left the imprint of their cracks on his forehead.
"No,"
she said with a sigh.
"I'm sorry, Oliver. My heart is ruined. But as long as you need it, my body will keep on."
And she stood and left for work. The next morning the kiss was late again. Oliver yawned and stretched and sat up and found his mother staring at the wall. "It's another ornament, Mother," Oliver said. Hanging up just beside the pearl globe was a tiny angel formed of the finest ivory. Her horn was of gleaming brass, and her wings were of lace so intricate it defied belief.
"It is lovely,"
said Oliver's mother, and she kissed him on the forehead and left for work. The next morning, a sprig of real emerald holly with real ruby berries bordered and detailed in purest gold wire was hanging beside the angel. Oliver's mother sat looking at it for a time, but her heart did not come alive. She said it was lovely, kissed Oliver, and left. Then a crystal bell was hanging next to the holly, then an opalescent snowflake, then the clear glass figure of a dancer blown with glittering flecks of precious metals. None of them brought Oliver's mother's heart back to life. Soon the tiny and misshapen room was covered in exquisite ornaments, all hung within the reach of a young boy. But still Oliver's mother would only look before kissing his forehead and leaving. The ornaments were taken from the governor's great tree, of course, but none were missed, for it was decorated with countless more. At last it was Christmas Eve, and Oliver felt he had one more chance to bring the glory of Christmas to his mother, and bring her heart back to life. So in the dead of night, when Father Christmas climbs down the chimneys of rich boys and girls, Oliver climbed up the governor's tree, and unfastened the star. It was so large he could hardly hold it under one arm, but he gripped it tightly and made his careful, difficult way down. He achieved the ground as the horizon colored with Christmas dawn. Oliver cried out, and, without changing out of his uniform, ran as fast as he could all the way home. He burst through the crooked door covered with needles and sap, with the enormous star held in both hands. His mother was awake, and her wide eyes took him in, then began to well up with tears.
"Oh, Oliver!"
she cried, and she flew to him to take him in her arms.
"Oh, Oliver!"
she said again.
"Look, Mother," said Oliver. "I brought you the glory of Christmas. Only look, Mother, and your heart will come alive."
But his mother would not let him go to look, and the star remained pressed between them.
"I am looking,"
she said.
"At last, I am looking."
And Oliver felt the heat of her tears upon his shoulder.
"I have it here, Mother. Won't you look?"
Oliver felt himself begin to cry. His mother knelt before him, and they looked at each other. Each image was washed in a filter of tears.
"You have done all this for me, haven't you, Oliver?"
Oliver could not speak, but he nodded. His mother took the star from his hands.
"Let's hang this up,"
she said, and placed it on the broken sill of the window. The dawn light was dimmed for a second, but then it found its way through the star's hallways of quartz and crystal and diamond, and broke upon the misshapen room like the undiluted essence of heaven, lighting each ornament upon the walls with a magical effulgence. The brilliance dashed the tears from the eyes of the mother and son, and they were bathed in a richness that not even Oliver's ancestors had known. The glory of Christmas shone in the eyes of Oliver and his mother, and they were happy. The star was finally an ornament that was noticed missing, and Oliver did not return his night page, which was also noticed, and this information was easily collated. But the governor was a typical rich employer, and prided himself on knowing as little as possible about those in his service. Oliver and the star were never found. But a few months after Christmas, a vendor was selling a perfectly round pearl with a golden hook that looked rather like a Christmas ornament. And even a few months after that, one was selling an ivory angel with a brass horn and intricate lace wings. "It's never too early to start collecting for Christmas," they would say to their potential customers, and they were right. Oliver de Bonancieux and his mother were collecting too, collecting little bits of light and glory all through the year, and collecting more money than they had ever before seen, of course, every time they sold another ornament. But they never sold the star, and at Christmas so much light shone through it that it was as if all the light they had seen and worked for and generated all through the year was stored up in its facets and shining out just for them. And every Christmas, Oliver's mother would look at the star, and then look at Oliver and say,
"My heart has never been so full."
And Oliver would look at his mother, and then look at the star, and he would smile. This has been The Glory of Christmas on Civil Radio, performed and written by Adriel Brandt, featuring Laura Brandt as the voice of Oliver's mother, and the Nebe Quartet singing O Tannenbaum.